Trevor's visitor. One fine autumn, Trevor the traction engine was looking glum. His friend Edward grew concerned. He waited for a red signal next to the orchard all day and grew more worried every time he passed by. At last, when he finally got one, he made good use of it. "Hello, Trevor. Why the long face?" Trevor smiled sadly.
"Oh, it's nothing to concern yourself with, Edward. You've already been so good to me."
"And I will continue being good to you. That's what friends do. Now, what's wrong?" The traction engine sighed wistfully. He didn't want to burden the railway engine, but he'd been grappling with this ever since he'd first been saved from scrap. He didn't think it proper to prattle on about his feelings to others. He was old-fashioned that way. But he was a sensitive engine, too, so he ended up doing it quite often anyway.
"I'm so grateful for your company,"
he began graciously.
"But I miss the other traction engines. It's been so long since I saw another engine like me."
Edward floundered. That was a difficult fix. Yes, they are sadly rare these days. They do hold steam galas at Hackenbeck and Dryall. Thomas takes people to see them every month.
"Ah, well, maybe I shall go to one then."
But he said it with no enthusiasm at all. Edward knew he was only being polite. Trevor was too sad to drag himself anywhere. Then the signal turned green, and Edward had to go. But he kept on thinking about Trevor all day. Edward's passenger service isn't like Gordon's Express. It stops at every station from the harbor to the terminus. Edward likes it that way. It allows him to check up on all of his friends. More often than not, someone will need help with something. But today, Thomas would help Edward instead. The old blue engine strode elegantly into the junction, and with impeccable timing. Thomas did the same. When they both came to a stop, the sound of their steam harmonized like two well-tuned instruments. "You're never late," chuckled Thomas admiringly. "Nor are you," winked Edward. "I know the trains are heavier now, but if you and I still ran this railway alone, I do wonder if we'd keep to time better." Edward just laughed under his breath. He wondered that too, but he'd never say it aloud. Thomas would get big-headed. "You look troubled," said Thomas, dispensing with all levity. "Who's it this time? Bulstrode? Cranky?" Edward, despite his availability to other people and their feelings, suffered from the same dreadful condition that Trevor did. He felt so very guilty putting his own problems on others. But Thomas never took no for an answer, and he could see the old engine's stress. Edward hid it very well, but nobody could hide their real feelings from Thomas. He wasn't the sharpest engine in the world, but in that way, he was very bright indeed. Edward confessed. "It's Trevor. I'm worried about him. He's so lonely, being the last of his kind." "We know how that is," said Thomas, with bleak humor. "No, I don't think we do. We may be the only remaining engines of our type, but we still have each other. Trevor has nobody at all. All the steam-powered road vehicles were scrapped a long time ago." "Did George get into an accident I didn't hear about?" wondered Thomas, not looking at all alarmed. "Perhaps ask him." Edward just stared at him, deadpan. "You are joking, aren't you?" A cheeky smile from Thomas confirmed that he was. "All the same, I could have sworn there was someone else, but her name escapes me." Suddenly, an interrupting boom echoed out from a nearby shed. Hideous gray smoke fluttered out of all the cracks and busted boards, and the mechanics inside coughed. "Careful where you're putting that spanner," snapped a voice, "and watch my brass." "Ah," exclaimed Thomas. "Yes, that's right. The Tin Lizzie herself." "The what?" exclaimed the voice, and with a thunderous boom, the doors flew open, and out came Elizabeth, the vintage lorry. Her driver held onto the steering wheel for dear life. "Tin Lizzie," repeated Thomas, as the old truck came to a halt in the station parking lot. "That's what they call cars, isn't it?" "I am no car," she huffed. "I am a lorry, and proud of it." "Sorry," mocked Thomas. "I meant to say the Fat Controller's work truck. and he laughed explosively, leaving Elizabeth in fumes. But Edward didn't laugh. Even if he had found it funny, which he didn't, he was too entranced. "Well, I'll be," said Edward marvelously. "A steam lorry. I haven't seen a vehicle like you in decades. You do look splendid." Elizabeth was smitten. She blushed. "Your friend has manners, Thomas. You should take some lessons from him." But, of course, Thomas had known Edward for 50 years already. If he hadn't absorbed his chivalry by now, he never would. "I'm Edward," the old engine said gallantly. "It is a pleasure to meet you." "Elizabeth," she said grandly. "No relation. I'm from the days of George V." "I know the feeling," chuckled Edward. "I'm from Queen Victoria's day myself, but, well, I'm quite used to being mistaken for an Edwardian." "Indeed! We had the names first," she laughed, pretending to be cross. "Who are they to copy us?" "Only the king and queen," he grinned. Both vehicles chuckled, empathetically. "Edward has a sad friend," blurted out Thomas. "Will you go and cheer him up?" Edward marveled. He was always struck by Thomas's forthrightness, even after all these years. "If he's half the gentleman that you are, Edward, then I would be delighted." "Wonderful," beamed Edward. "It's not too far, only 20 miles or so. He lives in a vicarage." "Ooh, sounds like a lovely holiday. I'll pack my things." She began a long, drawn-out 20-point turn in the parking lot. The nearby parked cars trembled in fright, their pupils shrinking in their headlights every time Elizabeth nearly clipped one of their bumpers. Then she hurried off back to her shed. Edward was not sure what things she could possibly be packing, but he surmised that if he had a big empty box on his back all the time, or at least one that wasn't full of coal, he might want to use it too. When she was safely out of earshot, Edward whispered to his friend, "She seems rather, irritable." Thomas swatted the notion away lazily. "Oh, she's just been in the shed too long. She needs to get out. Some quality time with another senior will do her good." "Senior, indeed!" snapped Elizabeth. Both engines jumped. She was back already, somehow, and very adamant. "Vintage, my good engine, vintage!" "Vintage, then," smiled Edward nervously. "I'll be back with a flatbed later today." "Flatbed? No, dearie. I can drive myself." And with a monstrous grinding of gears and belching of smoke, she left the parking lot behind and ventured out onto the open road. "Huh," said Thomas, stupefied. "So she's just going right now?" For Thomas the tank engine to marvel at someone else's boldness? They must be very bold indeed. "You might want to tell the Fat Controller. She is his truck, after all." "Yes, I think I should." But then he pondered for a moment and said, "I had best collect the flatbed anyway, though. It's better for him to think I took her by rail." Thomas could only agree. Trevor was standing in the tall grass at the edge of his orchard. He watched it sway back and forth in the wind. His old eyes traced the movement of the blades tiredly. He hoped Jem Cole, the farmhand, would paint the fence again soon. Then he could watch it dry. An unfamiliar noise jarred him from his thoughts. Listening closer, he realized it wasn't altogether unfamiliar. He'd heard it often in his youth, but he'd nearly forgotten what it sounded like. It was the sound of a steam lorry. He was ecstatic. Mr. Cole took the brake off, and Trevor swiveled his huge guiding wheels in the direction of the vicarage entrance, his flywheel skipping as he went. "Hello there, Vicarage Orchard. I've arrived," called Elizabeth with spirit, and then she emerged from between the trees and came to a halt in the grass. She shrunk a little when she saw the traction engine. "Oh, hello. Is there a vehicle here by the name of Trevor?"
"That would be me," he said sweetly. "Welcome to the Vicarage Orchard."
"I'm Elizabeth," stammered Elizabeth quietly. "Oh dear. Edward said nothing about his friend being a tractor." Trevor felt the wrinkles in his face change shape. He hadn't been anything other than sad or grateful in a long time, but now he felt something else. He was cross and a bit offended.
Does that disturb you? Asked Trevor pointedly.
No, no, lied Elizabeth. I expected an engine like Edward to keep grander company. Perhaps a steam-powered autobus. Trevor bit his lip, taking care with the words he let slip out.
No autobus here. I suppose you'll just have to make do with me.
They were off to a rocky start. Trevor tried to show Elizabeth how to do things, but she wasn't delicate. She was used to journeying long distances with her cargo, not petering around a tiny orchard. She nearly chipped the bricks on the vicar's house one time, and Trevor nearly blew a fuse.
Can you please take more care? The vicar trusts us with his property, you know.
Elizabeth was embarrassed, but she showed it by being cross instead. It's these clearances. I'm used to the open road.
I'm wider than you are. You should be fine, said Trevor sternly.
Elizabeth just harumphed. After a long and unproductive day, both engines retired crossly to Trevor's barn. The space was very, very small with two vehicles inside it now. Elizabeth's driver struggled even to open her door. He climbed out her back window instead and tumbled onto the wooden bed behind. He was eager to get to his guest room in the ranch house. But Jem Cole was more hesitant.
Will you be all right, Trevor?
He whispered to his engine.
So long as she doesn't light the hay ablaze, he said accusingly.
So Jem closed the doors tight, and both engine and truck felt more cramped than ever. Your vicar had really ought to invest in a proper garage, she said loftily.
He hasn't the money for that, said Trevor, amazed.
Well, he's a very important man, isn't he? Surely his congregation can assist him.
They do assist him, said Trevor gravely, in stocking Wellsworth Hospital with supplies and filling the Sudbury Library with books. And then he snapped, rather uncharacteristically, Now go to sleep.
And so they both did, without another word. When Trevor awoke the next morning, there was a great deal of noise outside. It made him smile. But Elizabeth looked very cross indeed. She had been awake for an hour already, and was spluttering with frustration. Thank goodness you're up, huffed Elizabeth. There are vandals outside. Go give them what for.
Vandals? We've never had vandals before, puzzled Trevor, as both of their drivers walked up to the barn, and each one of them swung open a big wooden door. The daylight flooded in, and both vehicles could see the vandals for what they were. A group of exuberant children, chasing each other around the field. Trevor chuckled brightly. Ah, there, you see? It's just the churchgoers' children. The service must have just finished. They're playing while their parents catch up with their friends.
Well, could they play somewhere else? They're making a racket. Trevor was agape. Sunday morning was the best part of his week. He loved watching the children's imaginations at work. Sometimes they'd even incorporate him. They had pretended he was a pirate ship once. With Jem Cole's permission, of course. Oh, goodness! They're utterly spoiling our lawn! The nerve! The funny thing was, they were both old, but Trevor was older than Elizabeth by a whole 50 years. If anyone should have been lecturing the children, it should have been him. But he'd never dream of it. It's not lawn, he corrected, with the perfect balance of English passive aggression.
These are the church grounds, and they are meant to be used.
But they're trampling the grass, she huffed. And just think, who will have to go fetch more sod from town and replant it all?
We will, I imagine, said Trevor,
entirely unbothered. So that's it then. We'll just let them horse around on our property.
If it encourages them to keep the faith,
smiled Trevor. Though, truthfully, those children hardly had the good Lord on the brain. They were more occupied by fantasies of cowboys and pirates. In my day, children were seen and not heard, said Elizabeth plainly.
Well, thank goodness we don't live in your day any more, huffed the traction engine.
But then he thought about what he had said.
Thank goodness we're in the present,
he said, his thoughts drifting away. For decades now, Trevor had been dreaming about the past. He had wanted nothing more than for things to go back to how they were. He missed his old work, his old friends, and the old values that his world had operated by. But as he watched these modern children playing gleefully in this modern courtyard after attending a modern church service, something dawned on him. He'd never heard children laugh in the old days, almost never. And if he were back in the old days, he never would again. Elizabeth was still beside him, grumbling audibly. Her weary driver tried to ignore her as he stoked her fire.
No, this won't do. My shed is far better. It's out of the way, and there are no little rascals nearby.
At that moment, the driver finally got her engine going, but she steered a different direction than he expected. Chalk it up to inexperience if you would like, but Elizabeth veered toward the exit with a will.
I'm sorry, Trevor, but I simply cannot stand all this tomfoolery.
Elizabeth's driver, who had given up on fighting her many years ago, decided it was best to oblige. He'd just have to send for his suitcase, he supposed. And just like that, Trevor was alone again. But not really. The kids seemed to grow louder without Elizabeth's watchful eye making them nervous. A couple of girls even ran over to the old traction engine.
"Trevor, will you be our aeroplane? We're the Wright brothers."
Trevor just laughed gleefully.
Well, I haven't got any wings, but I am old, and my milling wheel does fly, if nothing else.
That was good enough for the children. Seeing as it would be a few hours yet before the chores became pressing, Mr. Cole decided to keep Trevor's boiler cold a little bit longer. He hoisted both girls into the driver's seat, and then, when they asked, he even dug through the tool shed for a few old pairs of goggles. They were more for cutting wood than aviation, but the kids didn't mind. Now they were ready to take flight. Trevor didn't get very far off the ground, not at all, in fact, but his spirits certainly rose. When Edward came to pick up the churchgoers a bit later, he was relieved to see Trevor's cheery smile.
"Well, you seem to be in a good mood," he chuckled. Where's Elizabeth?"
"She doesn't like kids," answered Trevor simply, but he couldn't help saying it with a bit of judgment in his voice.
"Oh, I'm sorry," said Edward sadly. "She was meant to stay the week."
"Don't be," said Trevor. The renewed passion in his voice was unmistakable. Edward had never heard him like this.
"She was very rude indeed."
"Really?" puzzled Edward. "She was perfectly polite with me."
"You bring the best out of everyone, Edward," reminded Trevor. "Thank you for trying anyway, but Elizabeth's visit made me realize something. I thought what I needed was another road steamer from the old days, but she reminded me how dreadful the old days really were. People are so much happier now."
"On the whole," said Edward gingerly, and he spied a brightly colored flag fluttering from the church window, whose meaning he wasn't altogether sure of. It made him smile all the same. "For what it's worth, I don't miss wearing red, and certainly not black. These days are the best days by far." For the first time in his life, Trevor was actually beginning to see Edward's perspective. He whistled to the old Victorian engine as the train shuffled out of the little wooden vicarage platform. The two little girls waved to him from the coach windows. He gave one last toot, just for them. After all the day's chores were done, Trevor settled into his barn and relaxed. Jem Cole oiled him dutifully, and then headed home to the ranch house. Trevor smiled contently, straddling the very middle of the big, comfortable barn. For the first time in a long time, he was grateful to be alone.